Chapter 16. The wailing barely registered above Jeff's head as the ambulance swung around first one corner and then another. At least it felt like swinging to his perilous hold on reality. Every turn sent his shoulder crashing into the door, but it wasn't the recklessness of the driver so much as the weakness in his body that was betraying his balance. What little strength was left, he was fighting to will through the metal partition and into the back. Dustin needed the strength far more than he did. With that thought, others he didn't want to think flooded over him, and he squeezed his eyes shut to block them out. Finally, they screeched to a stop under the emergency room canopy, and the driver jumped out. Even the pain didn't make it all the way through his swirling thoughts as Jeff reached down, popped the door open, and all but fell out of the cab. Like a drunk on Saturday night, his steps threaded around the front of the vehicle to the other side, where blinding light cut right through his brain. 6 green-clad medical personnel already surrounded the single white gurney indented with 2 solid black boots, and in seconds they had slipped through the sliding glass doors. He wanted to follow them, but his spirit was the only thing still moving. "He's as okay as he can be right now," AJ said, striding up to Jeff from the back of the ambulance. "And he's in good hands. Come on, let's get you taken care of." When the phone by her bed rang, Lisa rolled over and squinted at the clock. 4:22. Gingerly, she sat up and scratched the side of her head. She cleared her throat and retrieved the receiver. "Hello? Lisa? Yeah? This is AJ Knight." The name sounded familiar. Where had she heard that name again? "Listen, I thought you should know Jeff's in the emergency room." Sleep's shackles shattered as her whole body wrenched up off the pillows. "What?" "I don't have time to go into details, but he's at Ben Taub General. Tell them your family. They'll let you back. Sorry, I've got to go. But Lisa?" "Yeah?" "Come, okay? He needs somebody." The middle of her hurt like it had never hurt before. Somewhere in the middle of the phone call, her heart had stopped, and with it her breathing. "Please, please, please, God, please let him be all right." When the white Cavalier rounded the last corner, even that prayer stopped. She counted 4 ambulances, all with their lights on, lined up next to the curb, and she knew it was bad. No, it was really bad. Really, really bad. Those words put wind under her feet as she jumped from the car and raced through the doors to the information desk. "May I help you?" the receptionist asked. "Yes, there was a firefighter brought in earlier. I'm his—" She looked down at her naked hand and carefully slid it under her other arm. "Fiancé." "Name?" Jeff Taylor." A pause as the computer worked on locating him. "Yes, he's in emergency bay 14. "And emergency is—" "Through these doors and to the right." "Thank you," Lisa said, fighting for breath as her steps picked up speed. The rubber of her tennis shoes thumped against the hard floor. At the doors, she pushed through them with one hand and entered a world of smattered commands and frightened weeping. Forcing resolve into the void in her heart, she half walked, half ran all the way to the sign reading admissions. Chaos. People, carts, medical equipment everywhere, and voices raking right over the top of them. She considered stopping to ask for directions, but there wasn't an unoccupied hospital employee anywhere. Instead, she turned her steps to the curtains on the side that read 1, 2, 3 above them. Never before would she have been so bold, but there was no thinking involved in this decision. At 14, she took one breath and pulled the curtain back slightly, just enough to look inside, and her soul shifted beneath her. In the next heartbeat, she was in the cubicle and at his side as he lay on the bed, gaze melded to the ceiling. On soft feet, she stepped over to the bed, aware that he hadn't seen her, although he was clearly awake. One gentle hand reached over and brushed the hair from across the grime-stained forehead. "Jeff?" Uncomprehendingly, he looked at her and blinked. "Lisa?" "Yeah," she said, trying desperately to squelch the tears. His chest heaved as anguish filled his face. "Lisa?" "I'm here." He reached for her, seemingly oblivious to the blood-red bandages covering both his hands. Her mind pushed that away from her. He was alive. All else they could handle. She held him, fighting to breathe through the horror crowding her heart. "I don't think Dustin made it," he said, and her mind collapsed around the statement. "What?" She pulled back from him. "Dustin? But—" "They called in all units," Jeff said as he released her and lay back into the plastic pillow. "We were trying to get some people out." "Shh," she said, realizing that if he freaked out, she might not be able to calm him back down. "Shh, just relax. I'll go ask, okay?" His eyes dipped back into the haze as he nodded and slipped further into the pillow. The gaze drifted back up to the ceiling as her spirit fell within her. Struggling to stay stoic in the face of an incomprehensible situation, she stepped out of the bay, sniffed once, and squared her shoulders for the admissions desk. "Yes, I need to know the status of a firefighter, Dustin Knox." "I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't." "Don't tell me you can't," she said as emotions crashed into her from every side. "He and his wife are close personal friends of ours, and if he's here and as bad as my fiancé thinks he is, then his wife needs to be notified." The young man sighed. "What's your fiancé's name?" "Jeff Taylor," she said, doing that hide the left hand maneuver again. "He's in Bay 14, burned hands." Charred seemed to be a better word, but her heart couldn't take being that honest. "And the other name?" "Dustin Knox." Her breath snagged at the top of her throat just below the prayers for Eve, for Dustin, for all of them. A pause, and then, "According to my records, Mr. Knox is in CCU, the critical care burn unit on the 6th floor, but he's not allowed any visitors at this time." "Oh," the syllable stopped as her world reeled on the news. "Okay, thanks." He nodded as her grief and shock reflected in his eyes. Carefully, she turned back. She wished she knew more, and yet one part of her was glad she didn't. At the curtain, she stopped and called for God himself to help her with her next task. Quietly, she slipped back into the cubicle and over to the bed. That never-blinking stare unnerved her to the very core. She couldn't lie, so her hand, that bare-naked left one, slipped up to his arm as the tears stung her skull. He's in CCU. They didn't know anymore. For one moment, Jeff's gaze turned to hers, which he searched to the depths of. Then he nodded, turned his head, and regained his silent conversation with the ceiling. She had never felt more helpless in all of her life. Do you know Eve's number? I think we should call her," she finally said. His gaze snapped downward to the sheet at his leg, and she wished there was a way around asking. "I didn't have the new one memorized yet." His voice sounded weaker with every word. "Is it at your apartment?" The nod wasn't even really there. "My keys are in my locker at the station. It's number 24 on the bottom. The book's in my top drawer next to the sink." She didn't want to leave him, not like this, but want and need were two very different things. Slowly, his gaze slid down from the ceiling and landed on hers. "I'll be all right. Eve needs to know." Emotion took over then as she leaned down to him and pulled the warmth of his kiss into her. Fighting the grief, she pulled away from him, and his gaze narrowed on hers seriously. "Drive careful, okay?" Never had she taken an admonition more to heart. He couldn't afford to lose someone else tonight. Rational gained the upper hand as the white Cavalier banked into the station parking lot. She had a job to do, and she was going to do it. Her friends were counting on her, whether any of them knew it or not. With long strides, she entered the vacant fire station. "Visitor!" she called, presumably for the benefit of the spiders in the corners, because no one else heard it. Lockers. Steeling her nerve, she walked down the hallway to the door beyond the break room, where she knocked solidly. Nothing. Carefully, she opened the door. "Knock, knock." Still nothing. She stepped into the room, past the benches, to the lockers. 24, 24. When she found it, her shaking fingers touched the cold metal and slid it upward. His locker. Somehow, she never thought she would see it. Staring into it, she couldn't help but feel his spirit wrap around her. Pushing the thought of Eve down, she grabbed the keys off the top shelf and then caught sight of the cross. In a split second, it was in her hand, and she was off to the next stop in this nightmare of a plan. It was like the world had forgotten him. Jeff could hear it, over the curtain, under the curtain, all around him. He could hear the pleas for help, the cries of pain, the ache of humanity just beyond that thin veil, and for all his heart, he wished that he would never again have to rejoin it. Lisa placed the first call from his apartment and was surprised to only get the answering machine. She left a vague message saying she would try back again. That wasn't the kind of news one delivers via answering machines. The second call she placed from the payphone in the hospital lobby. In the rush to get to him, she had forgotten her cell phone. This time, when she got the answering machine, she wondered if Eve was already here. Maybe someone had already gotten in touch with her. That thought lifted the pallor around her heart. Willing her steps to be steady beneath her, Lisa walked down the hallway, through the doors, past the admissions desk, and right to Bay 14. When she peeked into the curtain, her heart fell. He hadn't moved during the last hour, not a single inch. "I got you something," she said, approaching the bed slowly as the tiny bag of clothes she had procured from his place banged on her leg. Vacantly, he looked at her, and with a soft, hopeful smile, she held up the gold chain and cross, letting it dangle at the bottom of her fingertips. In the next instant, grief flooded across his features as he looked first at it, then at her. "You want me to put it on you?" she asked, and the imperceptible nod was unnecessary. Except to con a pitcher of water from a nurse once, Lisa left his side only to place her every 15 minutes phone call. By the time morning washed across a sky they couldn't see, Bay 14 had become their temporary home. She did everything she knew to do to make him more comfortable, which wasn't difficult. He was hazed out, barely acknowledging that the rest of the planet even existed. At 7:50, she looked at her watch. Presumably, they would get to him eventually, but his injuries didn't make it as high on the scale of life or death as too many of the other emergency room occupants had that night. Worse, even on a good night, she had heard of 8 to 10 hour horror story waits. It wasn't difficult to see they were a mere 3 hours into theirs. Sunday morning, the first one that she had really thought about church in years. Now her mind wondered, if she had just gone the week before, would it have made any difference? Would Jeff not be lying here? Would Dustin be at home enjoying the breakfast Eve had waiting? Slowly, Lisa shook her head. She didn't understand any of this, and something told her she never would. There was a bed shortage in the area hospitals. The scene the night before told Jeff that much. So, after the doctor appeared sometime around 11, did what he could with the blistering skin that covered Jeff's palms, and then asked if he wouldn't be more comfortable at home, Jeff understood enough to say, of course he would. Really, it didn't matter. He wasn't leaving anyway. With slow movements, he slipped out of the ash-covered shirt he had spent the night in, laid it on the bed, and picked up the one Lisa had put across the chair for him before she had quietly slipped out. A sleeve at a time, he worked the fabric over the bandages and onto his body. The fact that he couldn't have worked the buttons if he tried never occurred to him until the blue plaid was draped across his shoulders. Overwhelming helplessness in the face of all he had been through washed over him when he tried to take hold of the first button, and his knees went weak beneath him. "All better?" her voice asked at the curtain, and he looked up as pain slashed through him. "I can't get this thing buttoned," he said, and the words broke with the weight of the unshed tears. With a gentleness he had never experienced, she stepped over to him, took the top button in her fingers, and slid it into its rightful place. Down, one button at a time until they were all exactly where they were supposed to be. Then she took the bottom edge of the shirt and carefully worked it under the waistband of his jeans. When she was finished, her gaze locked on his. Better? Much. She turned and began picking up the heavy fire suit from the floor. If it's not too much trouble," he said, and when she looked at him, he held up both sleeves to reveal the cuff buttons dangling loose. She looked at it, questioning what she could do about that because it was obvious they were not going to close around the bandages. "You could roll them up," he suggested softly. Her skepticism slid into a smile, and she dropped her former task in a heap. A roll at a time, she turned the sleeves until both stopped just at his biceps. Then she stepped back. "Anything else?" Short of going back 24 hours and changing everything, he could think of nothing. "I guess that's it." Together, they crossed out of Bay 14 and back into life. After a quick check with her buddy at the admissions desk to make sure Dustin's condition hadn't changed, they went for breakfast, which Lisa had to insist that Jeff eat, bite by bite, until at least half of it was gone. The hands were going to be a problem, but she did her best to make sure they didn't interfere and remind him any more than they had to. When they went back to the hospital and up to the 6th floor, she stayed close to his side. Steady could hardly describe him. His steps swayed just as precariously as his spirit seemed to be. "Excuse me, we're wanting to find out about Dustin Knox," Lisa said at the nurse's station as determination echoed in her voice. "He's a firefighter that was brought in last night." The lady behind the desk looked at Lisa doubtfully. "He's a friend of mine," Jeff said, pulling the lady's gaze to him. The next second slid by, and then, just as she looked about to tell them to go away, the lady glanced down and caught sight of the bandages on his hand. "Are you?" She nodded. "Let me check." Her fingers clicked over the keys. "Mr. Knox is in critical condition. Only close family every 2 hours for 10 minutes. "When is the next visit time?" Lisa asked. 20 minutes, the nurse said, checking the clock. "Have you gotten in touch with his family yet?" Lisa asked, holding her breath for the answer. "No, ma'am. The department's been overwhelmed with this thing. I'm surprised we even know his name." It wasn't what Lisa wanted to hear, but she smiled anyway. "Okay." She looked around. "Where do we wait?" "Through those doors. There's chairs. Coffee, too, although I wouldn't recommend it." Lisa nodded. "Thank you." What she wanted to do was take his hand. Instead, she wound her arm under his and guided him across the lobby. "You know, Eve's machine is going to get tired of hearing from me." "I just wish I knew where she was," he said softly. "Yeah, so do I." Ever since he had seen that boot in the burst of flames, Jeff had tried to prepare himself for this moment, lining up the words in his head just in case he ever got the chance to say them. Now was his chance, but the tears choking out the air wouldn't let the words come as he stepped over to the unmoving figure on the bed. Dustin lay face down on the white sheets, and Jeff's own hands were no match for the strips of charred and crimson flesh rippling up and down Dustin's back. Jeff tried not to look too closely, for fear that his composure would collapse completely. "Hey, Dustin, man. What's up?" How many times had he said those words? 500,000? But they had never, ever felt like this. Defiantly, he pushed that away as he pulled a chair over to the bed. Dustin's arm, bent at the elbow, wound up next to the short brown hair so that his hand lay right next to his still closed eyes. "Boy, this really stinks, huh?" Jeff blew the air out of his lungs slowly. "Listen, we're trying to get in touch with Eve. Lisa's on perpetual vigil by the phone. We'll get her here, though. Don't worry. We will." I know she wants to be here with you. I know she would be if she knew." He sniffed back the tears and ran his cheek down the plaid sleeve. "You know, I know, if you can, you're going to come back to us. So don't take this like I'm writing you off or anything. But there's some things I think you should know. I didn't get to say them last time, and—" He closed his eyes to stop the words. The breath out was harder to control this time. "I want you to know how much I appreciated all those hours we spent together. I know you had Eve, and you didn't have to make time to include me, but you did. I appreciate that." Pulling the tears back to him, he sniffed. "More than you'll ever know. You should also know that I'd never have made it through the academy without you. Back in November, oh man, every time I needed someone, you were always there, although I think you talked more than you listened." A small laugh jumped through the center of the tears. "When didn't you, huh? But I needed that. I really did. There wasn't a second all the way through the academy that I wasn't glad to have you by my side." The tears came again. "Not one single second." The words stopped, held by the invisible grip of grief. "Look, we both know this thing's bad. Yeah, we do. But if God thinks you've got some more to do here, then you've got to know that I'll be right by your side every step of the way, no matter what." A sound at the door, and Jeff looked over to where a nurse slipped in. When she saw him, she stopped, unsure of what to do next. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone—" "That's okay," Jeff said, swiping at the tears with his own bandages. "I'd better let him get some sleep." He looked at the closed eyes one more time, said a silent goodbye, and stepped away from the bed. At the door, he could hardly catch his breath for the tears, and it was at that moment that the nurse laid a soft, comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll do everything we can," she said gently. He knew that, of course, but as he stepped out into the bright room beyond, he couldn't help but think their best wouldn't be enough. Shoulder to shoulder they sat in the little waiting room as the seconds turned to minutes and the minutes turned to hours. At 5:30, Lisa tried to talk him into going home to get some sleep, but she knew even saying the words was pointless. No, he needed to be here, and so did she too. They had managed to get in touch with Dustin's fire station, but between the two shifts that fought the fire, there weren't enough men to spare one at the hospital. At 7, Jeff had willed his way to the phone and called his own department. No one he knew was there, but they took a message anyway. "I think I'll go try Eve again," Lisa said just before 8 when the waiting began to grate across her nerves. At the payphone, she deposited her dwindling supply of quarters and listened to the phone ring. However, the 4th ring never made it across the wires. "Hello?" The voice sounded fragile and frightened. "Eve?" "Yeah?" "Eve, this is Lisa." "Lisa? I just got home. What in the world is going on?" Can you get down to Ben Taub General right away?" Lisa asked, forcing her voice to sound urgent but not dire. "We're on the 6th floor." "How's Dustin?" "We'll talk when you get here," Lisa said, feeling Eve's knees go weak in her own. "And Eve, drive careful, okay?" "Oh, okay." Breathing down the tears, Lisa walked back into the waiting area. "She's coming." His gaze grabbed hers. "You got a hold of her?" "She'll be here," Lisa said. Jeff looked up at the clock. "It's 8. I'd better go give Dustin the good news." Lisa nodded. "Yeah, I'll wait for Eve." "Good news, buddy," Jeff said when he pulled the chair over. "We finally got in touch with Eve. She's on her way. You know, if I didn't know better, I'd think you were looking forward to having her for your nurse for a while. Yeah, don't deny it." He smiled half-heartedly at his own lame joke. "I'm going to try to talk them into letting her come in as soon as she gets here, even though it won't be visiting hours anymore. I know how much you want to see her, and how much she'll want to see you." The machine behind him screeched to life, and the bottom of Jeff's heart dropped through his feet as he turned to look at it. In 2 seconds, a host of green-clad workers were rushing into the room. Code blue! Code blue! Respiratory failure! For the second time in what seemed only moments, Jeff felt himself being pulled backward. We need to get in here, sir. Please. In disbelieving horror, his body backed away, although not a single other piece of him did. The small jerks of the body on the bed sent fist-hard punches right through Jeff's gut. We're losing him. His blood pressure's dropping. Time and space floated away from Jeff's consciousness as he stood there in the corner, watching the scene, but never moving. Dustin was leaving, and somehow he had to find it within himself to let him go. It's okay, buddy, he whispered so that only the spirit now floating above them could hear. I'll take care of Eve for you. I will. You do what you have to. A solid beep permeated the air around him. I'll take care of her, I promise. At the door to the waiting area, Jeff's steps slowed until he couldn't even be sure he was still moving. However, the moment he emerged through the door, Lisa was there, worried and confused. What happened? All the alarms went off and... Words wouldn't come as Jeff looked into her eyes, and the message was received in the next second. Oh my God, no. She covered her mouth to stop the words. Oh, Jeff, no. I'm so sorry. Her hand reached over to his shoulder, and for that moment, he needed to be in someone's arms more than he ever had before. Warm, tender, and alive, she surrounded him in her embrace and just stood there, holding him as though she would never again let him go. And with that, life and death met in a silent embrace. The warmth of the windows as the sun dipped below the horizon at their backs did nothing to thaw Lisa's dead-cold spirit. Dustin was gone. Eve would be here any minute. Jeff looked like he might pass out any second, and somehow she had to find the courage to help them all, even though what she really wanted to do was curl up in a dark corner and cry her eyes out. When the elevator dinged, they both looked over to it. With a quiet whoosh, the doors slid open, and Eve rushed out, wild-eyed with panic as she looked around for what to do next. A moment too long, Lisa hesitated, and in her place, Jeff stood, looking far too steady for the shifting her world felt like it was doing. Jeff, what happened? Where is he? Eve asked, rushing toward them, her feet going as fast as her words. Lisa saw the breath he took and the square of his shoulders when he faced Eve and put out his arms to soften the blow. He didn't make it, Jeff said softly. Oh no, Eve said as her hand went to her mouth and her knees buckled. No. Jeff seemed not even to notice the bandages as his hands and arms caught her on the way down. Gently, he took her to a chair and sat her down. The torment in her eyes when she looked up at him tore Lisa's heart right out of her chest. She could never have found the words to continue. However, carefully, as Jeff sat on his heels in front of the woman who had suddenly become a widow, he looked unnervingly calm. Dustin said that he loves you. He wanted you to know that, Jeff said quietly. Okay? He did. He loved you so much, Eve. And when Eve leaned forward into Jeff's arms, there was no way anyone would have questioned that the feeling was mutual. Chapter 17. His car was still at the station, but although outwardly Jeff looked better than it made any sense to, Lisa knew that him driving in that state was not a good idea. So, after Eve's parents arrived and their usefulness waned, Lisa suggested that they get him home for some much-needed rest. Of course, he didn't want to go, but her focus was increasingly on how he was dealing with this, and he was really beginning to worry her. There is nothing else we can do here, Lisa said emphatically, even as she fought to keep her voice under control. However, the glance from Eve across the room told her it hadn't worked as well as she would have liked. Slowly, Eve got up and walked over to where they stood by the now dark window. Lisa's right, Eve said, and her voice was stronger than Lisa's would have been. She is. You should go home and get some sleep. But his eyes were glassy with pain and lost sleep. No, now you listen to me. We have a long couple of days ahead of us, and you need some rest. Softly, she laid a hand on his arm. Please, for me. At those words, his gaze snapped up to hers, and in his eyes, Lisa saw the tumult of emotions just before he nodded and his gaze fell. Good, Eve said, and when she pulled him into her arms, neither could comfort the other's grief. Finally, Eve stepped back and wiped her eyes. You take care of yourself. I'll call you tomorrow. Then she turned and looked at Lisa, and her tears became harder to contain. Take care of him for me, okay? In an instant, they grabbed for each other like the only line that could pull them up from the side of a crumbling precipice. If you need anything, Lisa said as tears streamed down her face. Eve nodded her acknowledgement of the statement. When they backed away from each other, both had to wipe their eyes. Now go home and get some sleep, both of you. Home. Somehow it had never felt so empty. The world seemed to be spinning without him. Sense had ceased to exist, drowned in the haze of tears and fear and shock. Still, somehow, Jeff kept walking as though if he just kept going, at some point, he would walk right out of this nightmare, or right off the edge of the earth, and either would have been welcome. I'll throw something together, Lisa said after she had turned the key and let him in. How do sandwiches sound? He shrugged, having not really heard the question. His feet carried him over to the couch where he sat, looking at the room and trying to remember why it was he was here. A sound, a small whir, and a voice filled the air. Jeff, man, where are you? This is Gabe. They said you checked out of the hospital. Call me when you get in, please. Jeff's mind couldn't focus on the number Gabe left. It couldn't focus on anything. Through the sounds of the dishes, he heard her voice, but only dimly. Yeah, he's okay. His hands... I don't know. I think so. Yeah, it was bad. No, we finally got in touch with Eve, his wife. No. Okay, I'll tell him. Thanks, Gabe. I will. Bye. A plastic-on-plastic knock, and the voice went silent. He should be moving. Some part of him said he should move, and yet nothing would. Here you go. Lisa came striding into the living room a few minutes later with a plate which she set on the coffee table in front of him. I'll get you some water. Bewildered at the sight of a simple sandwich, Jeff could only blink at it, and in seconds she was back. Carefully, she sat next to him on the couch. You're going to have to eat, she said after a moment. Here, I'll break it in half. Then, for good measure, she broke it into quarters. There, that should be easier. Still, he looked at it. The memories in his brain were no longer making it all the way to his body. Finally, she picked 1/4 up and slid it between the tips of his fingers. Eat. His gaze fell to the sandwich, and then, blinking off the action, he put it to his lips. The middle of his stomach threatened revolt. It hurt to chew. Every piece of his whole body hurt, ached under the strain of keeping him alive even one more second. A piece at a time, she handed him the sandwich and then watched to make sure he ate it. When it was gone, she took the plate away and was back before he knew she left. See, that wasn't so hard. Here's a painkiller. The last one will be wearing off any minute now. She gave him the pill and watched as he swallowed it. Good. Now I think you've got a date with a pillow and a mattress. What do you say? No words would come. There simply weren't any more in his brain. Come on. She coaxed him up off the couch. I'll tuck you in. Lisa didn't have the heart to pull him back out of the bed when he collapsed into it the second they stepped into the bedroom. There were more important things than clean sheets. Better? She asked, pulling the top cover up and around his shoulders. But when his gaze caught hers, she wondered if things would ever be better again. "Will you lay with me?" he asked, the words barely a whisper. The pleading in his eyes was more than her heart could bear. She smiled, turned out the light, and walked to the other side. Carefully, she lay down and slid over to him, flipping her hair back so she could hear his heartbeat when she laid her head on his chest. She needed to be close to him, and if he needed to be close to her, there wasn't a no anywhere in her body. "How is he?" Gabe asked, late the next morning from the phone that Lisa had caught in the middle of the first ring. "Sleeping for now, which is good," she said, keeping her voice quiet in the softness of the kitchen. "What are we supposed to do about work? Does he need to come in sometime?" "I talked to Rainier, and it'll be okay for him to come back when he's ready. This week or early next. The sooner the better, so Rainier can set up his leave status and all that. But get him through the funeral first. We can deal with the other stuff later." Funeral. She hated that word. So, is there somebody down there that he can talk to when he's ready? About what happened? "We've had a counselor on call since Saturday night. If he needs it, all he has to do is ask." "Okay, thanks, Gabe." "Sure thing," Gabe said quietly. "And, Lisa?" "Yeah?" "We're all sorry for your loss." "Yeah," she said, but the syllable broke in two. "Thanks." When she hung up the phone, she knew there was one more call she had to make. It was a call she had never made even once in her life. On the other end, the receiver clicked. "Sherry, this is Lisa. Yeah, I'm fine, but I'm not going to be in for a while. There was a death in the family, and I've got some things to take care of here. I probably won't be in until at least Thursday." "Yes, I know it's Monday. Tell the guys to get whatever they can done, handle what you can, and I'll deal with the rest when I get back." "Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Talk to you later." Her hand hung up the phone as every other part of her said it just wanted to go into work. Not because of work, but because somehow then she could make believe this wasn't what it was. In the middle of that thought, a tremendous crash sounded from the bedroom, and she dropped the plate she was holding to the cabinet and ran. "Jeff, what's wrong? What happened?" she asked, bursting into the room only to find him seated, head down, on the edge of the bed. With lifeless eyes, he looked up at her. "I just wanted a drink." It was then that she saw the shattered glass sprawled across the solid black base of the weight bench. "I guess it slipped." As she watched, he slowly bent to try to retrieve the pieces. "No!" she yelled, jerking toward him. "Don't! I'll get it." Every instinct in her said that her job now was protection and prevention, and she took that job very seriously. "I'll get you some water, and I'll get that cleaned up when I get back. Don't move." Sitting on the bed, looking at her with that vacant stare, she knew the glass wasn't the only thing broken. If she could have wrapped him in tissue and put him high on the top shelf, she would have. Anything so she would never have to see that frightening helplessness around him again. "I know what this is asking," Eve said slowly. The soft gray of her fitted suit dress picked up the silver flecks in her dark eyes as she sat in the sunlight of her parents' living room Monday afternoon. "And believe me, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." A full night and half the day's rest had cleared enough of the fog surrounding Jeff's senses so that the fact that she was tiptoeing around him wound all the way to the place in his brain that could perceive the information. Regardless of the fact that half the neighborhood was milling about, watching the scene, his focus was on only her. "Anything, Eve. Name it, and it's yours." "You were his best friend." Her gaze fell, and she took a shaky breath. "I'd like you to give the eulogy." With a screech, the world stopped around him. Me? I think he would have been honored for you to give it, she said with a tight smile. And I know it would make me feel better. Please, Jeff. I swear, you know I wouldn't ask if... A breath of a decision. He had made a promise. He nodded. Okay, I will. You will? She asked in surprise. Yeah, I will. What are you going to say? Lisa asked, not wanting to pry, but wanting to know all the same. They had been by Eve's side all day and half the evening, and there hadn't been an opportunity to ask until they were alone in her car, headed back to his place. I don't know, he said, his voice wistful and far away. I wish I did. Her gaze went before her hand, which touched the side of his arm. You're a good friend, you know that? But his gaze just sank into the black oblivion at his feet and stayed there. Whatever you say, it will be just what Dustin would have wanted. For as long as Lisa could remember, she had wanted to ride in a limo, but somehow this scenario had never entered her mind. Across from them sat Eve, flanked by her parents, the dark glasses hiding nothing. The private memorial at the little funeral home was enough to make a stone weep, and to this minute, Lisa's brain was having a hard time comprehending that the man now lying in that coffin had been her dance partner less than 2 weeks before. Laughing, joking about his hopeless friend, and now that friend was preparing to give the speech of his lifetime. She hoped Dustin wasn't far away because Jeff was going to need all the help he could get today. More than that, if anyone tried to convince Dustin what his friend was about to do, he would never in a trillion years have believed them unless he saw it for himself. She looked around at her fellow passengers. There were 2 at the center of the grief in that car. The others were there to help them get through it. Dark, navy blue. It was that color that would be with Lisa forever when she thought about how walking down that aisle alongside Jeff, a heartbeat behind Eve, felt. She could almost smell the polish on the shoes, feel the scratchy wool from every uniform that turned to watch the entrance of that flag-draped coffin in front of them. The walk to the front of the church could have been no longer. It was like walking the wrong way on a moving carpet. She walked, and still she got no closer to the front. Not until the 6 men with hands on the rails of the coffin stopped, checked it, and stepped back, did the reality of what they were about to do hit her. With a breath, she grabbed onto Jeff's arm with both hands. One bandaged hand came up to meet her hand, but he never looked at her. Somehow she had to pull it together. He didn't need to be holding her up right now. No, he had other far more important tasks to concentrate on, and she needed to be there for him, even if it killed her not to break down into hysterics right there. When the preacher signaled Jeff's cue, his legs stood and he felt her hand slide from his arm. Courage was a pitiful thing in the face of that moment. Absolutely pitiful. At the podium, he turned to the audience, which gazed up at him like he knew something that would make this whole horrible situation go away. But he knew nothing. For 3 days, I've tried to sit down and put some words on paper, he began, and each word was a fight to get out. There were a couple of problems with that, though. 1, the pen was kind of hard to hold. He held up one bandaged hand, and there was a small ripple of choked laughter. 2, I'm not very good with words. A smaller ripple from those who really knew him, he was sure. And 3, what do you say at a time like this? He sniffed back the tears, laid his bandaged hands on the podium, and ducked his head. It was only with great difficulty that he raised it again. So, I didn't write anything down. Instead, I thought I'd tell you a few things I know about Dustin Knox, and for that, I don't need ink anyway. His gaze found the second row where Lisa sat, holding him up on the softness of her gaze. He tried to smile at her in assurance that he could handle this. He tried, but it didn't quite make it that far. During our time together at the academy, I learned some things about Dustin that I am sure some of you don't know. He was really into football for one. He loved the Cincinnati Bengals, although he really could have picked a team that wins a little more. I'm sure his wallet would have been appreciative. Smatterings of laughter sounded in the midst of the sniffs of tears. He made a mean bologna sandwich, and he always carried a comb in his wallet and one in his car, just in case. More laughter, this time louder. He was always on time. Well, except for his own wedding, but that really wasn't his fault. The nod and smile from Eve told him he was on the right track. Dustin Knox never knew a stranger. He could walk right up and strike up a conversation with Attila the Hun, and you would never have known they hadn't been best friends forever. And he was always the first to help out when someone needed it. Studying, working, cleaning, it didn't matter. If someone needed help, Dustin was there. Always with a smile, and never making you feel like he'd planned anything else for that moment. There wasn't a guy at the academy that he didn't help over at least 1 or 2 rough patches. His own rough patches you rarely saw. Others were always more important to Dustin. Always. The breaths were getting shallower, but Jeff pressed forward despite them. Here's something else I know about Dustin Knox. There was a certain young lady that took his breath away, and there wasn't a moment that he didn't want to spend with her. Not one. Dustin and Eve weren't 2 halves that made a whole. They were one. So much so that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. And that was exactly the way they liked it. Jeff sniffed the tears back into his skull and pounded a bandaged knuckle on the podium lightly. He would get through this, for Eve, if not even for Dustin. I can't tell you why this happened. I don't have any grand answers. I wish I did. All I can tell you is that Dustin Knox lived every moment of his life to the fullest. He didn't waste a single one. It's a standard I think each of us should strive for, because we never know. The tears came then as haunting flames ripped through him. We never know. He sniffed, but the tears were overtaking him. Dustin, buddy, we're all going to miss you. There was no escaping from the cold, salty droplets as they slid down his face. May you rest in peace. And quietly, he stepped away from the podium. With everything he had, Jeff wished he was the one in the coffin that the pallbearers set over the open grave. It had to be easier than the reality he was now standing in, the one that seemed intent on breaking them all in half. The pressure of Lisa's fingers grasped his arm gently as the preacher read. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou dost prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and kindness shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. May we pray. A beat of silence as Jeff prayed only that he would wake up any minute now, that this nightmare would stop, that time would stop, and he could somehow just get off. Lord, in your infinite love, we know you are with us now, as always, the preacher said. Please use our grief as a means to purify these lives we must now lead. Bless especially Eve and all the men and women who serve unselfishly to protect us all. And take Dustin now to the special place you have prepared for him with you in heaven. In your holy name we pray. Amen, whispered across the crowd spread across the breeze-swept grass. The preacher signaled to the 2 uniformed firefighters, who snapped forward and slowly lifted the flag from over the coffin. In its place, someone slid a bouquet of red, white, and blue flowers, as the other two wrapped the cloth until no red or white could be seen. One of them slid the last of it into place, took it to Eve, and presented it to her. Jeff squeezed his eyes closed to stop the tears, but forced them open because he couldn't be weak the moment Eve had to be strong. "From dust we came," the preacher intoned, holding a hand over the coffin, now stripped bare of the flag which Eve clutched to her chest like a long-lost teddy bear. "And to dust we shall return. Father, we commend our brother Dustin into your hands. May he rest in peace. Amen." The first one through the line was the preacher, who shook Eve's hand, said a few words, and moved on to her parents. When he stepped up to Jeff, the pain in the center of Jeff's chest fought to get to the surface even as he pushed it back down. "Thank you, Reverend," Jeff said, struggling to keep his grief in check. "You did a good job, son," the preacher said. "I know that was tough." "Yeah, well, some things you have to do. If you ever need to talk, I am here." "Thank you," Jeff said, wishing it didn't hurt so badly to smile. As the preacher walked on, many, many more mourners took his place. Most didn't know what to say. Some hugged him, some didn't. All said how sorry they were, and what was left of his sanity thanked each of them for coming. When Ramsey stepped up in front of him, it didn't even register who it was at first. The dress blues, no smile. He wasn't sure why, but it just didn't look like Ramsey. "You did good, man. Nobody could have done it better." "You heard?" Jeff asked, wondering how the news had reached Ramsey. "Everyone in Texas has heard by now." Everyone in Texas, somehow that was fitting. "Thanks for coming," Jeff said. "I wouldn't have missed it." 3 people further down, and Bridget stepped up. With no words, she wrapped Jeff in her arms. Jeff felt the clap on his back from Craig as he held on to Bridget, fearing he might fall right through the earth if she let go. "I can't believe he's gone," Jeff breathed. "I know," Bridget said, nodding as the tears slid down between them. "I know." 6 more people down, and gaze glued to the ground, hands in pockets, AJ stepped up. "I'm sorry, man," AJ said quietly. "I wish we could have done more." Jeff shook his head as he extended half a smile. "You did everything you could." For one moment, AJ stood stock still, and then he put his arms around Jeff. The breath out felt like a car shifting down without the benefit of a clutch. "Thanks for coming." One more second before, with barely a nod, AJ stepped back and then walked on. The nightmares, the questions, the regrets would now live with them all. One look at AJ's eyes told Jeff that much. Willing the haze to take over his brain, Jeff greeted the next mourner. "Just don't think, and you'll get through this." But on the other side of this, he could see only the abyss that they were all headed for. It was coming. He could feel it rushing toward them, intent on swallowing them whole, and he couldn't be sure he had the strength to fight it off this time. Sometime in the middle of the line, it occurred to him that if that line just went on forever, they would never have to leave, never have to walk away, never have to say that final goodbye. So, it was with an ache in his heart that he saw the members of his own station as they inched their way forward, the line dwindling behind them. People were talking again, the service was over, and life was going on, whether that made any sense to him or not. "Taylor," Hunter said, stepping up to him. "Thanks for coming," Jeff said, holding out a hand wrapped in white. Instead of taking it, however, Hunter threw his arms around his colleague, and the bear hug slammed tears into Jeff's skull. "Get better, okay? We need you back." Jeff nodded. As soon as Hunter let him go, Dante grabbed him. If he could just hold onto someone, it felt like maybe he could stay standing. If not... "You know, Knox must have been one smart guy to have you for a friend. I don't think they come any better, Dante said. He pulled back with his hands on Jeff's shoulders. Hurry back, okay? Again, Jeff nodded and was passed off to Gabe. I've been worried about you, Gabe said, leveling his gaze at Jeff seriously. You know that you don't have to handle this alone, right? We're all here for you, every one of us. Don't forget that, okay? His head was nodding for no other reason than it hadn't gotten the signal to quit. Slowly, Gabe nodded too. Take care of yourself. When Gabe stepped over to Lisa, emptiness washed over Jeff. There was no one else. Cars were leaving. People were walking away. Blankly, he looked over to Eve, who stood by the coffin with one hand slowly rubbing across the top of it. With a heavy heart, he walked over to her and laid a hand on her waist. Her gaze slid up to his, and the anguish in his heart was no match for the agony in her eyes. She laid her head on his shoulder, and the tears came for both of them. Long after the last car was gone, and they had sent Eve in the limo with the assurance that they would just get a cab, Lisa sat next to him in the empty graveyard. He was so alone. She could see it in his eyes. His heart was shattered into 10,000 pieces, and she had no idea how to pick up even a single one. In fact, her presence seemed not to even mark the blank slate of his consciousness. I should have said he liked trees, Jeff said softly, and Lisa's gaze went to his face. Pine trees were his favorite. Pines and firs. Something about their needles. He squinted into the thought. I don't really remember why. You did all you could, she said gently. I am sure he was totally amazed you got up there at all. Well, I didn't want to. It was the first time he had admitted that. I thought I was going to lose it there for a minute. Man, that was hard. But you did it. I just wish I could go back and do it all again, Jeff said. I think we missed so much. No, she said with a soft smile. I think you got all the important stuff done. His gaze swung to her face. You think? Yeah, I do. Under her hand, the bandages lifted, carrying her hand right up with them to his lips, which he laid softly on the smooth skin. I couldn't have gotten through this without you. Gently, she laughed. Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to. Their hands dropped back into his lap as he took a ragged breath in. Well, I guess it's time to go. Whenever you're ready. When he looked at her, she knew the words before he spoke them. I'll never be ready. Me either. In the next second, she was in his arms, and for as safe as that should have felt, in this place, it felt anything but. For here, there was no denying that one day, instead of holding him, she could be the one left holding only a flag and pleading with God for just one more chance to hold him again. It was the most sobering space she had ever occupied in her life. Chapter 18. He was lucky, that's what the doctor said when Jeff went in on Thursday. 5 weeks, and he could be back on active duty, good as new. Another week, and he would be able to go back on light duty, and although the doctor went on to explain how easily the damage to his hands could have been much worse, Jeff still didn't feel all that lucky. Numb was a better word for it. Tired and numb. When he crawled behind the wheel of the GTO, 1,000 memories were there waiting for him. None of them were good, and none of them understood that he just wanted to be left alone. As he drove down the streets, he thought about going by to see her, but he knew how overwhelmed she must be with all the work that would have piled up in her absence. That was part of it. The other part of it was that he hated the pity in her eyes. He hated when she hesitated, trying to find the right words so he wouldn't be reminded. It didn't matter. The reminders were everywhere. In fact, they were attached to his own body. How much more reminder did he need? Thoughts swirled inside him until he was surprised his brain didn't just shut down from the overload. He needed someone to talk to. Angling his car off the freeway, he turned up the station street. Days and shifts crisscrossed in his brain so that he had no idea who would be there when he walked in. Anyone who understood would be a blessing. The trucks sat on the driveway pad, the water dripping along the sides as Jeff walked up the sidewalk toward them. "Heads up!" the voice yelled from the other side of the truck, and Jeff smiled as the sponge hit the bucket of suds, sending a fountain of them into the air. "You know, you're going to have to show me how you do that sometime," Jeff called. Instantly, Dante's head appeared at the top of the truck. "Jeff, what in the world are you doing here?" Jeff shrugged. "Where else am I supposed to be?" With one leap, Dante was on the ground. "You're injured, boy. Injured. That means you can stay at home and watch soap operas all day, and eat bonbons if you want to." "Bonbons, huh? Are they any good?" "I wouldn't know. I've never gotten the chance to try them. You, on the other hand, have a perfectly good excuse. And what do? Come here. Now, tell me, in what realm does that make sense?" "Taylor," Captain Hayes said, emerging from the dark station. "What brings you by?" Jeff held out his hand, which the captain shook very carefully. "I was hoping Captain Rainier would be in. I wasn't sure what shift it was today." "C shift today, but Rainier's upstairs anyway. Paperwork, you know. Come on." The clock couldn't go fast enough for Lisa. At 4:42, she could have sworn it had actually stopped. It wasn't until she watched it for a full 2 minutes before she decided it hadn't. "The Chronicle ads came out today," Sherry said, walking in as Lisa stared at the clock. "They turned out pretty good." She laid them on the desk. "Huh. Did you know that if you look at it real closely, that clock hand looks like it's bent?" Bent? Sherry asked, glancing back at the clock. "No, can't say I've ever noticed that." "And that little peggy thing in the middle. How do they get it so that it holds the hands where they're supposed to be, but still lets them move?" "I wouldn't know." Somebody should look into that. Surely there's a grant out there for something like that, wouldn't you think?" Sherry's blank look and utter silence brought Lisa back. "What?" "Nothing." Sherry stood there for one more moment and then pointed at the desk in front of Lisa. "The Chronicle." Lisa nodded and looked down dutifully, although she never saw anything. Life itself was a blur of worry and fear. When she looked up again, Sherry was gone, and Lisa thought it was probably for the best. She couldn't hit rational with a 2-foot pitch. The clock tugged her gaze back to it, and she stood in surrender. He would need supper. Taking a shower with only elbows was one of the hardest things Jeff had ever tried to do. How he had managed to accomplish it prior to this, he was sure was a question only the haze surrounding him at that time could answer. The plastic bags and rubber bands covering his hands helped, but not nearly enough. His fingers felt like immovable sticks, and pressure on the palms felt like a million tiny needles jabbing into every nerve ending. He couldn't hold the soap. It ended up on the floor, and the little bit of shampoo he managed to get out seemed to go everywhere other than his hair. It was the epitome of frustration. Finally, he leaned an elbow against the faucet to shut off the water. That would have to be good enough. Another week in these infuriating bandages would be a real test of his aggravation tolerance. He pulled on sweatpants over his boxers. Jeans were out. A t-shirt would have to work too. Buttons and zippers were enough to make a monk curse. When he stepped to the bathroom mirror and worked the sink drawer open carefully, the top edges of his fingers delicately worked the comb upward. This had always seemed so easy before. Everything had seemed so easy before. Halfway to his head, the comb slipped from his grasp and bounced across the floor. With a frustrated kick, he sent it crashing into the cabinet. What had he done to deserve this? Any of this? He heard the knock out front, but it, like the phone, would have to get itself. Doorknobs were now the bane of his existence. "Come in," he called angrily as he trekked through the living room. 3 brown bags of groceries in hand, Lisa walked in. Don't ever go grocery shopping at 5 o'clock. It's a madhouse. "When should you go?" he asked, bewildered by her entrance. "Midnight. It's much saner." She set the bags on the counter and started unloading them. Watching her, he leaned on the cabinet. "I didn't know you were coming tonight." Incredulously, she looked at him. "Of course I was coming. Didn't I tell you that?" "Not that I remember." "Well, who did you think was going to change your bandages?" He glanced down at his hands, now free of the plastic bags. "I hadn't really thought about it." "Well, it's a good thing one of us did. We don't want those things around any longer than they have to be." She put 3 things in the cabinets. "So, what'd the doctor say?" "Oh, he said I was lucky. Next week, I can go back to light duty," Jeff said, as if that was the most natural news in the world. The whirlwind of action around her slowed. "Next week?" "It's a good thing, too," he continued, oblivious to her unspoken concern. "Sitting around here is going to make me nuts in like 10 seconds. Her motion resumed, although not nearly as fast as it was before. "I went to the station today. Dante was washing the truck. He's insane." Barely moving, she put the cheese in the refrigerator. "I didn't know you were going back in today." He shrugged. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." For a moment, there was only the sound of the last 2 things in the bag being put away as he struggled to find a topic. "So, how was work?" It was there. Problems and more problems. Same old thing. "Liver?" she asked, holding up a small plastic container. "Whatever. I think I'm going to sit on the couch and put my hands up a little. The doctor said I'm supposed to." "Okay," she said, nodding. When Jeff walked out of the kitchen, it was all Lisa could do to keep the exhale quiet. He didn't need to know how hard this was for her, how her stomach turned when she worked to redress the swollen red and purple wounds, how every small gasp of pain he sucked in went right through her like a knife, how tired she was from sleepless nights spent worrying about him and about Eve. She had tried to call Eve earlier in the day, but she wasn't home. Lisa wished she knew the number for Eve's parents. Somehow, she thought after the funeral, Eve would have ceased the campout at her parents' house, but apparently that hadn't happened yet. Not that Lisa blamed her, she just would have liked to know Eve was okay. Trying not to think about what the raw liver looked like, she used a dish towel to cover it while she cut it into thin strips. Meat. Good red meat. Food to make him strong again. Food to help his body to heal. She only wished there was a food that could make the slices in her soul heal as easily. Jeff noticed the small chunks of meat in the gravy. He noticed that even he could pick them up. The plastic glass she had put his water in had ridges in all the right places so it wouldn't slip from his bandages. He wondered how much she had thought about those things and how many were mere coincidences, but he didn't ask. Asking would ensure a conversation that he wasn't ready to have. So, what little they talked, he focused on telling her about all the things the guys were doing at the station during his visit and how he couldn't wait to get back there, back to life. A life that didn't involve sitting around with his hands above his head for hours. A life where he didn't even think about the difficulty of picking up a comb or a simple glass of water. A life where he could choose what to eat by what he was hungry for rather than by what he could conceivably get out without making a total mess. "This is really good," he said as the food on his plate disappeared. Her fork pushed one mound of liver around. "You sound surprised." "No, not surprised, really." Then he caught himself. "Well, a little. I thought takeout was more your style." She shook her head. "Too much grease. You don't need that, right now." Her face beat that comment back. "So, what did you do for lunch today?" He pushed his plate over so she could put more liver gravy on it. Some little TV dinner thing I found in the back of the freezer. It was Chinese food, I think. You, she asked, stopping in mid-scoop and not even being able to get the last word out. She took a breath. I'll make you something tonight, for breakfast tomorrow and lunch. What would you like? For breakfast? Yeah. He raised his eyebrows. How would I know that now? Because I'm going to make something for you now, and making it without knowing what I'm making is going to be rather difficult. So, what do you want for breakfast? He wished he knew, if for no other reason than to calm the frustration in her voice. How about a bacon sandwich? Good, then I'll make a bacon sandwich. They were like two robots getting through one task just to get to the next. After supper, Lisa did the dishes, made his bacon sandwich, and put the leftovers from supper on a plate draped with plastic. The fewer fine motor skills he had to use, the better. Then she walked into the living room. You ready to change those? Do I have a choice? He asked, not fully kidding. No, but I thought I'd ask anyway. She walked over to the couch. Come on, let's get this over with. That night, as he lay in bed alone, looking up at the ceiling, his thoughts drifted over her. For one brief moment in time, she had let the business side of her down to reveal the woman underneath. Now the business side was back in full force. Even when she kissed him goodnight, it was more about her duty than her desire. He felt it, and he wondered if she did too. On Friday, Murphy's Law kicked into full force in Lisa's life. There were the ads that said Cayman instead of Camden. There was the whole, I think my computer's got a virus thing from Sherry, which took a full 2 hours to fix. Then there was the call from Tucker, who Lisa simply didn't have the patience to deal with anymore. Why do you keep calling me? She asked furiously as the end of her rope sailed away somewhere high above her. I thought you had decided. I told you I'd call you back, Tucker said uncomprehendingly. That we'd talk, don't you remember? She couldn't remember anything before she'd heard the words, Jeff is in the hospital. Everything before and since was a solid blur. I tried to call, but Sherry kept saying you were out. I thought you were avoiding me. The sigh escaped her before she knew it was there. I was out of the office the first part of the week. Out? On vacation? Funeral, she said levelly. Oh, I'm sorry. Like water seeping from a barely opened drain, she felt the energy ooze from her body. So you haven't done any more on the leadership conference then? No, it was all she could muster. Good, because I talked to Grandpa and we've decided we want to include some of our own factory workers and supervisors. You know, get them in the game too. In the game. She had never felt more out of the game. I can give you their names if you want, Tucker said. I don't have time to meet with you. No, I mean now. You got a pen? Somehow she took down the names, but it would be a miracle if any of them were right or even legible. When Tucker finished the list, he signed off, and Lisa was left holding the phone. Tired, pulled on her eyelids. Slowly the desk took her head, and she was asleep before her body could protest. Except for the ache in the muscles of his forearms, Jeff was beginning to get used to the hassle of using everything other than his hands to do things. He had learned to open cabinet doors with his elbows, to open chip bags with his teeth, and that feet were good for a lot of things he had never noticed they would be useful for. However, when he tried to start supper, the limits of his improvisational abilities ran out. By the time he gave up, a jar of pickles lay in pieces on the floor by the refrigerator, and half the carton of milk was spilled all over the counter. The tuna can was open, but upside down under the can opener, and every time he stepped, he trod on another fork or spoon he had dropped. A few he had managed to get back up to the cabinet with his toes, but the others were now one interminable web of stainless steel booby traps. Hi, Lisa called when Jeff was in his room doing sit-ups next to the bed. If he couldn't be useful, he could at least work off his frustration. Jeff? Yeah, he called. I'm back here. 81, 82. What's up with the kitchen? She asked, surveying him carefully when she made it to the door of his room. Tuna sandwiches and soup, he said, pulling himself forward. I thought that sounded good for supper. Uh-huh, she said with a nod. Then she shrugged and arched her neck one way, squeezing her eyes closed at the pain that caused. Okay, well, I'll be in here when you're finished. Okay, he said. 93, 94. When she turned down the hall, it occurred to him how slow her steps had become, and a vague concern for her traced through him. At 110, he pulled the towel off the weight bench and threw it over his shoulder before walking to the kitchen. He found her bent over the shards of glass at the refrigerator. Those pickles had a mind of their own, he said timidly. Yeah, it looks that way. He waited a beat. How was work? Work, she said, dumping a handful of glass into the trash can. Have they come up with the office supply ads yet? I don't know. I was working on other things. Like what? Like, I don't know, other things. Oh, he said quietly. He paused a beat, trying to decide if he should venture into the next subject that came to mind. Gabe came by today. That's nice. With the little hand sweeper, she worked to corral the last little green shards cowering under the counter. He said they've got a new truck coming in next week, a brand new one. They're going to trade the old one down to one of the suburbs. That's nice. I wonder how different this new truck is going to be. You know, if we're going to have to retrain for it or anything. With a clang and 3 thumps on the trash can with the dustpan, Lisa stood and wiped her hands. She closed the trash can, put it back in the corner, and stepped over to the counter where she ran water on a dish rag and started wiping up the milk. Hayes must have some pull, though, to get a new truck. That other one's only 8 or 10 years old. The milk clean, she stepped over to the other cabinet and picked up the tuna can. How about tuna casserole, seeing as how we don't have any more pickles? He shrugged. Okay by me. Gently, he wiped his forehead with a towel. I really can't wait to get these bandages off next week. This itching thing is starting to make me nuts. Your hands? She asked with concern. No, everything else. Do you know how hard it is to itch your nose with these things? He held both hands up in testimony. It's annoying. I can imagine, she said softly as she dumped the contents of first one can and then another into the pan. His nose slipped from his consciousness as he really looked at her. Are you okay? I called Eve today, Lisa said, although her back was to him. You did? To make sure she's okay. Is she? Guilt slid over him for not thinking to make that call himself. She's trying to be, Lisa said, but her voice didn't make it all the way through the statement. Gently, he walked over to her and laid a hand on her shoulder. In the next heartbeat, she spun into him and crushed her eyelids into his chest. I can't imagine what she's going through right now. I can't even imagine it. Something told him as he held her that she could come closer to imagining it than most of the other people on the planet. On Saturday, they went to see Eve. Lisa drove although they took his car, so talking on the way was out. She needed too much brain power to work the car. That was good, though. In her books, the less they talked right now, the better. At the little townhouse, Lisa tried not to imagine them moving in, decorating, dancing in the kitchen, but it was difficult. Everywhere she looked, she saw not only Eve, but Dustin too. Jeff was right. They were inseparable. So, how are you doing? Jeff asked when they sat down in the living room, which opened high above them into the bedrooms upstairs. Surviving, Eve said softly. How about you? I've been better. How are the hands? Bandages come off in a week. And then? Light duty only for 4 weeks, he said with a nod. At least that will give me something to do. Next to him, Lisa shifted on the couch, reaching for a change of subject. How are your parents? Adjusting. I think if they could, they'd put me in this little box and bubble wrap me, you know? But I'm just trying to get to the next minute in one piece. Has the station called? Jeff asked. They've been great, really supportive. One of the guys even brought the things over so I wouldn't have to go down there. For that, Lisa was thankful. Standing by Jeff's locker traced through her, but she pushed that away. So do you think you're going to stay here then? Eve, thinner even than Lisa remembered, sat wordless for a long moment. I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead yet. I go back to work on Monday, and then I guess I'll see where life takes me from there. Right now, there's no big plan. Eve's gaze fell to her hands. Not anymore, anyway. The fight against the tears was obvious in her voice, and when she looked up, they were glittering on her lashes. I'm sorry. Lisa's own resolve buckled as she watched Jeff stand and cross the 2 feet to envelop Eve in his arms. Hey, don't ever apologize to us, he said as he held her. If you need to cry, then that's what you need to do, and that's okay. Eve sniffed. It's just that we always knew this was a possibility, you know? We always did. I just somehow never thought it would be us. No one does, Jeff said as he held her. No one does. She sniffed again. I feel like such a burden on everyone, like they all have to stop what they're doing to take care of me. Hey, you're not a burden. Besides, that's the point of this life, being there for each other. If we didn't have that, what would there be to live for? He hugged her and then pulled away to look at her face. This thing is on your timetable. As long as it takes, we'll be here, okay? Slowly she nodded. Don't ever forget that. The whole next week, Lisa tried to keep that comment in her heart, as long as it took. That's how long she wanted to be there for him, and she was determined not to let him forget it. So, when they were seated at the table over pasta the next Friday, it was all she could do to squelch the terror when he made his announcement. I'm going to start hazmat classes in September, he said, as if he was telling her he'd picked up the dry cleaning. The noodle slipped down the wrong pipe in her throat, and Lisa choked on it. Hazmat? Yeah, hazardous materials. I didn't get my certification when I got out because it was going to take too long, but I really think it would be a step in the right direction now. Besides, if I take it in September, I can take aircraft rescue in October and be fully certified by November. She swallowed the protests with the drink she took. But your hands... The doctor said it shouldn't be any problem by September. Besides, if I get these 2 certificates, then I can start working my way up the ladder to driver, and then to lieutenant. Her gaze wouldn't leave the table. I didn't know you wanted to work up the ladder. Of course I do, he said with a small laugh. Doesn't everybody? Well, yeah, I guess. When do you start? They were the hardest 4 words she had ever spoken, followed instantly by the 2 hardest she had ever heard. September 2nd. Lisa couldn't get that date out of her head. While she redressed the wounds that were looking far too good for her sanity, while she sat next to him on the couch watching some movie she didn't really care about, while she stood on his threshold saying goodnight and wondering how many more good nights they would have. In her dreams, Eve was there constantly, saying how she had never thought it would be them, and Jeff was there, sitting next to her in that graveyard, and she was there, clutching a flag and screaming at God above for one more moment with him. In the daylight, she held her world together by the barest of threads, hoping against hope that he would change his mind and end her nightmares. It was this side of impossible to hear him sound excited about going back to work. She hated that job, the station, and everything associated with it. If she could just find a way to tell him that, make him see that it was killing her to think of him walking into another fire, that her heart seared at the center just thinking about it. If she could just do that, then her world could get back to normal. If she couldn't, she was vaguely aware that nothing would ever be right again. Chapter 19. Jeff was glad to be back at work, even though he took some ribbing for the whole light-duty thing. He knew that the comments were meant to make a bad situation a little better. As long as he took the painkillers religiously and watched out for that one sore spot in the web between his thumb and finger on his right hand, he was okay. In fact, he thought, as he worked a metal maintenance kit across the floor with his foot, he had found ways his body could help that he had never realized were there. "I need that torque wrench," Gabe called from the front of the truck as he worked on the motor in mid-August. "At your service," Jeff said, handing the tool over. "New truck. You would have thought the thing would run for more than a couple of weeks." "Takes a while to break them in," Gabe said. "Kind of like women." Jeff laughed a little at that. "How's Ashley anyway?" "Thrilled. We got an offer to go to New Orleans with her parents over Labor Day weekend." "Well, that's good." "No, it's not. The flight leaves Thursday. We're on shift Friday." "Oh, great." "Yeah, that's what Ash said, except with more colorful language." The wrench clicked on the metal. "So, how's Lisa?" Jeff shrugged. "Good, I guess." The clicking stopped, and Gabe looked over at him. "You guess?" For all he was worth, Jeff wished he could hold Gabe's gaze. This month's been kind of tough on her. Gabe's working slowed. "I can imagine." "She doesn't talk about it much," Jeff said, squinting through the middle of that thought. "How about you?" "What about me?" "Do you talk about it much?" Gabe handed the wrench back. "What's to talk about? I'm okay." He held his hands, which now sported only a couple of Band-Aids, up for inspection. "Getting better every day." Gabe bent back over the fender. "I didn't mean your hands." "She's having enough trouble as it is. She doesn't need my sob story to add to that." "How about someone to lean on?" Gabe asked. "Does she need that?" "She leans on me," Jeff said defensively. When Gabe looked at him, Jeff got the feeling that he could see all the way through him. "That's good, because I know Ashley. She'll drive herself into the ground to take care of things for me, if I let her." "Yeah, well, I think Lisa's hanging in there," Jeff said, although his certainty at the statement waned the moment it was out of his mouth. Gabe nodded. "I'm sure she is." No matter where he ran, Jeff couldn't get those words to leave him alone. How much had Lisa taken care of for him in the last 4 weeks? And he had let her, leaned on her for strength and sanity the whole time. Like a rock, she had stood there, unbending, unbreaking. Yet until that moment, he hadn't really even noticed. Tuesday afternoon, when he woke up, the fact that it was repayment time swelled within him. He owed her, and now it was time to start paying her back. When Jeff stepped into her front office at 4:30, a bag of takeout hot dogs in hand, he put a finger to his lips so that Sherry wouldn't alert Lisa that he was here. Quietly, he stepped to her office door as Sherry stood to stop him, but he put up a hand to warn her off and to shush her protest. The second her gaze dropped to his hand, however, he saw the step she took backward, and he tried to smile at her to assure her he was fine. Her look said she knew better. Without a sound, he turned the knob and cracked the door to Lisa's office. "What? You think this is a joke?" Lisa asked furiously as the phone cord dangled around the back of her chair to the receiver. "Trust me, I am not in the mood to be coming up with jokes at the moment. Now, if you would be so kind as to check your records, I am sure our payment will be documented in your accounts receivable. We sent it on the 10th of June. I don't care if it's not showing up in your computer. I am telling you we sent it. I've got the canceled check right." Her chair spun around, and Jeff's breath caught. She looked at him, and her eyes tilted across the fury. Her hair stuck out in all directions, the circles under her eyes were hard gray lines, and the edges of her skin were sallow and sunken. When had all of that happened? And why hadn't he noticed? Quickly, she bent her head and swiped across her desk. Here. It's number 1715 for $1,241.19, made out to corporate printing on the 10th of June. It even says what it's for down here. Leadership brochures. Yeah, I can fax it. Would that help? Fine. I'll have it there in 2 minutes. What's the number? In a scrawl that looked far too pointy and slanted for her writing, she transferred the number to the yellow pad, which couldn't have been staying on the top of the stack by more than 1/8 of an inch. Yeah, I got it. Okay. The phone hit the cradle, and she stood without so much as acknowledging him. She ripped the paper out of the notebook and the check off the top of her desk and stomped out to the front office. Fax this to corporate printing, now. On her heel, she turned and stalked back into her office and around her desk where she started sorting through the top layer stacked there. I didn't know you were coming. I didn't either, he said softly. Is this a bad time? Her face was hard. It's always a bad time these days. Then she seemed to remember who she was talking to, and she closed her eyes and took in a long, slow breath. When she opened them again, it took a moment for her to look up from the papers. I'm sorry. Her face had softened in the span of seconds, and even the circles had lightened. Did you need something? I was going to pick up some groceries before I came tonight. I figured you were probably out of milk if you ate cereal this morning. Watching her, his heart asked how he could have been so blind. No, I didn't need groceries. I just wanted to see you. It's been a while since I've been over here. Oh, she said, the act sliding away from her. Well, you should have called. I would have. Her hands dropped to the desk as they moved folders back and forth, fighting to make her world look less chaotic. Slowly, he set the bag in the chair, stepped around the desk, and took her in his arms. I'm so sorry. Even in his arms, he could feel the rigidity of her body, stiff, like iron. Unsettled, she barely returned the hug before backing away from him and swiping at her eyes. That's okay. I just had the office supply place call about the radio spots, and I can't find the Camden report to save my life, and damn it. Her hands slammed the folder they traced across down. I can't do anything right anymore. She reached up to lay a finger on the top of her nose to stop the tears. How can I help? He asked, as helplessness washed over him. The composed look that she finally leveled at him chilled him to the bone. I think this is one I should handle on my own. He felt himself back up. Are you sure? Yeah, she said softly. Don't worry about it. Pulling sanity to her, she shook her head to push the emotion down. I'm sure I can dig out from under this mess somehow. I could... No, Jeff, she said, the iron just under the softness in her voice. I can do it. Oh, okay. His feet backed him around the desk. You going to come to my place tonight? Slowly, she nodded. Yeah, I'll be there. I thought a small can would be enough, Lisa said as she stood at his stove stirring the meat sauce. It's always so hard to tell. Had he not seen the before and after picture? He never would have guessed, he thought, as he leaned against the counter and watched her. Never. Hair perfect, eyes tired but circles gone. No, he never would have guessed how out of control she looked when she wasn't in his company. Somehow, he knew that wasn't a compliment. These companies, they think we don't notice how much they're skimping on the contents of their product. She lifted the can. See, 14.5 ounces. It used to be 16. I did a paper on that in college. She set the can back on the counter. So, how was the station? Busy. That new truck's giving us problems. Already? Her hand reached down and spun the knob to lower the fire as she continued to stir. Didn't you just get that thing? Jeff shrugged. Gabe thinks it's a timing problem. Huh, sounds logical, she said, although he wondered if she had any idea what the term even meant. Somehow, he hadn't noticed how few in-depth questions she asked about the station. A few here and there to keep the conversation going, but nothing beyond that. It was like she didn't want to know anymore. This stuff is like paste. She picked up the spoon and turned it over. The red sauce glopped back into the pan. Quickly, she opened a cabinet and pulled out a measuring cup he didn't remember having. "Could you get me some water?" "Sure," he said, taking the cup from her. He filled it and returned it to the cabinet beside her. It was the first time he had been so close to her in what felt like years. Gently, he put his arms on either side of her arms. "You smell good." "Yeah, like overdone meat sauce." One push at a time, he swayed to one side and then the other. Why had he ever been so reluctant to dance with her? He must have been insane. "What are you doing?" she asked, and he heard the annoyance. "Dancing," he whispered in her ear. "You don't dance, remember?" With one arm, he spun her around. "Oh yeah, I forgot." He tried to bury his head into her shoulder, but she wouldn't stay still long enough for him to accomplish that. "Hey," she pushed him back. "Hello, I was cooking." "What, you don't want to dance with me?" he asked, and the hurt in his chest screamed through his voice. Her eyes closed on the accusation. "I'm sorry. Of course I want to dance with you." As he took her in his arms, he knew something had changed. Their timing was off. Their rhythm was off. They were off. "Want to talk about it?" he finally asked when the space she put between them punched through his heart. "You don't want to," she said, shaking her head miserably. "How do you know that?" She looked at him, and bright tears glinted across her lashes. "The fire stays at the fire, remember?" Her gaze dropped from his. "I'm trying to." His heart broke for the pain he had seen in her eyes. "Come here." With just enough hold on rational, he reached over and snapped the fire off from under the meal. Then he led her to the couch, sat her down, and laid an arm around her shoulders. "I know this has been tough on you, the burns and keeping me together, and Dustin." The breath she took in seemed to steady her as she sat up and put her elbows on her knees. "That's part of it," she said, nodding as though she was telling herself this lecture. "If you're with a fireman, that's part of it. You just have to learn to deal with it and go on. Dwelling on it doesn't help. Worrying will make you crazy, so you deal with it, however you have to." "That's what you've been doing, huh? Dealing with it?" "I don't have a choice. I love you, so there isn't another option." With that word, his world slammed to a stop. "What did you say?" She looked back at him, but her face was laden with sadness. As she straightened her head and her shoulders, sorrowful determination slipped into her eyes. "Love isn't about when it's easy. That's what Mom used to tell me, but I never really understood that until recently. I watched her, my mom." Lisa nodded at the memory. "When Dad was late for supper and she'd get upset about it but try to act like she wasn't. Yeah, she'd just keep going like it wasn't a problem. And the nights he'd come home too tired to help with us, Mom would feed us supper, help with the homework, run the baths, read the stories, and put us all to bed. I asked her about it once, and she said, 'Lisa, that's just what you do when you love someone. When you really love someone, you can't think about yourself anymore.' I'd never found anyone that meant enough for me to do that before you. Fact, I guess I'd decided it'd just be easier if I didn't. Families, relationships, they just complicate life too much. At least, that's what I used to think before." "You went to a bar and made the mistake of finding someone." "Something like that," she agreed. "At first, I thought Mom was wrong because I felt like it wasn't nearly as hard as she always made it look. I don't know." Lisa sighed softly. "All I know is I want what's best for you, and I will do whatever I can to make that happen." "And what about you?" Slowly, she shrugged. "I just have to figure out a way to live with it." He slid over beside her. "But I don't want you to have to do that. I don't want you to have to live with it. I want you to be happy too." Her fingers crisscrossed over themselves. "Well, from where I'm at, I don't see how both of us can be happy. You want one thing, I want another, and for you to get what you want, I don't get what I want. The track she was on slid from under his feet, and if I get what I want, you'll be miserable. What do you want? The question stopped the thread of her words. After a moment, it was with permeating acceptance that she looked at him. Something I could never ask you to do. She shook her head. Don't worry about it, okay? It's just the adjustment. I mean, I was a free spirit. I could come and go as I pleased, do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. And now I feel like I'm tied to something that I really want to be tied to. But it's taking a while for me to get my life rearranged around it. Although he should have been happy about what she was saying, he couldn't quite get there. She was giving up her life because of him, and somehow he thought that wasn't how it was supposed to work. Suddenly, she stood and straightened her jacket. I've got to finish supper, or it'll be midnight before we eat. He watched the back of her navy skirt walk into the kitchen and around the corner, and never in his life had he wanted to talk to Dustin more. Some rational advice from a friend who really understood would have been really nice right about then, because one thing was for sure, he himself had nothing resembling rational running around anywhere in his brain. Chapter 20. For 2 weeks, Jeff spent his time either at work or tiptoeing around Lisa. She was better, from what he could tell. On Friday night, they went to the movies and had a nice time. He held her hand, she kissed him goodnight. Once or twice, she had even laughed, but the melancholy in her eyes was never far away. By the next Tuesday, however, when she was making supper, she surprised him with a joke Sherry had told her. Slowly, the light was coming back into her face and into her spirit. They talked about the weather and how annoying the city could be. They talked about who was going to pick up groceries and whose night it was to cook. But venturing any deeper than that, neither one was willing to take that leap. It was easier to push that aside, to pretend that if neither acknowledged its presence, it didn't really exist. Well, I guess this means you're sprung, Gabe said August 25th when he entered the back room of the station at 6:30 in the morning and found Jeff elbow-deep in a washtub full of water. I told Hunter we'd get this, Jeff said, indicating the cotton hose he was washing. They just got back from a residential. Gabe nodded. Let me grab some coffee so I can get my eyes open, and I'll help. Like I'm going to turn that down, Jeff said with a laugh, very much liking how it felt to no longer be on the injured reserve list. Hey, Mr. Taylor, Captain Hayes said, coming through the door. I thought you were banned from the water thing. Good as new, Jeff said, holding up his hands for inspection, and then laughing when he realized they were covered in white suds. Hayes smiled. Glad to hear it. He stepped past the tub and then turned. Say, have you heard from Lisa lately? I saw her at the funeral, but I had to get back to the station before we could talk. Yeah, Jeff said slowly. I see her all the time. Why? Oh, well, I was just wondering how that conference is coming together, Hayes said. She hasn't been by in a while. Jeff's heart sank on the statement. Yeah, I'll probably see her tomorrow if you want me to ask her for you. If you think about it, Hayes said with a shrug. Well, a bed and some breakfast is sounding mighty good about now. Tell Lisa I'll be here in the afternoons all week if she wants to come by. I'll tell her, Jeff said as the words choked in his throat. When Hayes walked out, Jeff sank his hands deep into the water, wishing the signals going to his hands could crowd out all those in his head. So you couldn't come up with some excuse to keep you on light, huh? Gabe asked as he walked up, a coffee cup steaming in his hand. Why would I do that? I don't know, because it's, easier? Depends on your definition of easier. Well, it's not washing cotton hoses out when you don't have to, Gabe said, indicating the emerging stained white hose as it was transferred into the other sink. It's called getting on with your life, Jeff said, heaving one part of the hose out of the water. Oh, really? And what else do you have planned for this getting on with your life idea? Gabe asked teasingly. Hazmat classes for one. I start next week. Then I'm going to do the aircraft thing in October. Get that out of the way, too. Ah, gunning for my job, are you? Just trying to do what makes sense, Jeff said defensively. Gabe leaned on the water tank next to the tub as he narrowed his gaze at Jeff. And where does Lisa fit into all of this? Jeff's work slowed. Right where she is now, by my side. So, you're going to be doing hazmat, aircraft, and planning a wedding all at the same time? That's industrious. Hey, now, who said anything about a wedding? You did. You said she was going to be right by your side. And don't go flaking out on me here. You're in love with her, right? For a long moment, there was no answer. Right? Right, Jeff finally said softly. And she loves you, right? Right, Jeff said more solidly. Then what in the world are you waiting for? An engraved sign to appear in the sky? In all the time he had spent with her, this thought had never occurred to Jeff. Why? He didn't know, because it seemed so obvious. She was beautiful, gorgeous, fun, hard-working, and dedicated. And she loved him. She had told him so point blank. What more could a man want? No more, he decided as he transferred the hose to the rinsing tank. No more. Everything had to be perfect, Jeff thought, as he set the 2 wine glasses on the table which was set with the tablecloth he had spent half an hour choosing. There were 3 more in the back closet on standby if this one hadn't worked. Candles just so, plates, the non-chipped ones, were on the table. Silverware, all but one matching, lay next to the plates. It was as perfect as it was going to get. Carefully, he turned down the lights and traced into the living room where he turned on the CD that always made him think of her. Yes, tonight was going to be perfect, even if he had to knock himself out to get it that way. Work, as usual, was one thick mess of trouble. Lisa exhaled as she pulled into his apartment parking lot and saw the GTO. He was here. She sighed at the thought. She hadn't had time to call him to find out how his shift had gone the day before, although that was all she had thought about for 36 hours. Every beep on her intercom made her jump. Every ring of the phone made her heart pound. At lunch, she had spilled her coffee all over the table when a siren wailed through a close intersection. Her nerves were on the very edge of disintegration, and it was taking everything she had to hold them together. When she opened his apartment with a key she had finally just taken, it was a moment before she realized that anyone was even there. That's when she saw it, the table set, the candles, the wine, and her breath jumped to her throat. Jeff? Hey, are you... However, here never made it to her voice, because suddenly he slipped around the corner and leaned there looking at her. White shirt, blue cover shirt, black jeans, that cross, and half of the lopsided smile, and she knew whatever was up, it was big. Hello, he said softly. You made it. I did, she nodded, frozen to the spot at the door. You didn't tell me you were cooking tonight. I wanted to surprise you. Well, that worked. Her gaze chanced to the table as he pushed away from the wall. Here, you look like you could use a little TLC. He took her arm and led her into the living room, which had even less light. At the sofa, he sat her down. How about a neck massage? Carefully, he sat down beside her and turned her shoulders. Oh, I don't think... Hello. His fingers worked into the grooves of tension in her shoulders, and their pressure sent waves of exhaustion undulating through her body. Slowly, she relaxed into the motion. That feels good. It's supposed to, he said right in her ear. She felt his fingers as they left her shoulder to trace across the side of her hair. Helpfully, she reached up and snapped the clip so that her hair tumbled onto her shoulders. Better? He asked. Much. Her eyes closed of their own accord as her body and spirit moved in time with his fingers and the beat on the stereo. did you go to masseuse class while I wasn't looking? Nope, first massage I've ever given. Huh, you ought to open up shop. You could make good money. One finger hit an extra sore spot, and she jumped forward. Ow! Sorry, he said as his fingers continued, but lighter now. Nope, these are just for you. Then I'm not telling anyone. If she could have gone to sleep right there, she would have. Would you like some wine? He asked, after time no longer held any meaning. Do you have to stop to get it? I think so. I'm good, but I'm not that good. Then no, I don't want any wine. He laughed as he pulled her back to him on the couch. You're too easy. You're too good. Muscles she had forgotten she had relaxed all the way down the length of her body. She took a deep, long breath. This was something she could definitely get used to. Drifting. That's what it felt like. Forgetting everything else in this one moment. She never wanted to join reality again. I made your favorite, he whispered in her ear. What's that? Lemon pepper steak, carrots, potatoes, and unburned cherry pie. Sounds delicious. But it's going to be hard to eat from in here, he said. Her body relaxed into his. It's called osmosis. How about we call it eating? As much as her body would let her, she laughed. Come on, he said, helping her up. It's going to get cold. Wouldn't want that. By the time he served the pie, she had forgotten her surprise at the sight of the table. It was like remembering she was alive as they debated the merits of cherry versus apple pie. Cherry getting points for pulling off tart and sweet, apple garnering its own share for the addition of cinnamon. You finished? Jeff asked when Lisa laid her fork down by her half-eaten pie and sat back. Yeah, I think that would be a good word for it. She sat for one more second, sighed, and then pulled herself up to pick up the dishes. No, Jeff said, stopping her with a hand. I'll get these later. His hand turned and caught hers. Let's go relax for a while. She arched an eyebrow skeptically. If I relax any more, I'll go to sleep. Oh, don't do that, he said, taking her in his arms in the center of the living room. You might miss something. Slowly, he swayed back and forth as her arms over his shoulders pulled him closer. Oh yeah? Like what? A second of a pause, and he slipped to the floor on one knee. Still holding her hand, he looked up at her. The room spun around her as her head said this was not really happening. Lisa, I can't imagine living the rest of my life without you. Will you marry me? Marry? Lisa asked, blinking through the shock. I'm... what? With a snap, he opened the little box in his hand as her mind said how many hours she had spent worrying about the very hands that now held that box. Inside the box was a thin gold band supporting a small sparkling stone. I know it's not much, but... Jeff, she said as her heart pushed tears in front of the words. Oh, I love it. It's perfect. And indeed it was, gentle and subtle, the perfect reflection of him in her heart. So? He asked, still on his knee, gazing up at her. She closed her eyes to imprint the moment on her memory. To say no was to deny who she really was, and who she really was at that moment was a woman who loved the man kneeling in front of her with all of her heart. Yes. With a smile, he stood and gathered her into his arms. Her eyes squeezed close as he stood simply holding her as though he might do just that forever. I didn't think it was possible to be this happy, he finally said softly. You didn't? What about me? Her heart burst inside her. I hated guys, remember? All guys. And now I'm getting married? She squealed on the words. Oh my gosh. Haley is never going to believe this. Haley, heck, I don't believe this. Oh man, Sherry's going to go nuts. He laughed. I thought you didn't want to be married. Did I say that? She asked innocently. Yeah, I think so. Well, I must have been delirious. Or maybe I'm delirious now. I don't know. I'm just so excited. Is it me or the ring? He asked jokingly. It's you, of course, you dope, she said, and she laid her lips on his, pushing into him so that he took a step backward. When she broke free, he looked at her with a smile. Oh, good. Then I'll just take this back. He started to put the case in his pocket. Oh, no, you don't, she said, pulling his hand free of his pocket. Your ring goes on my finger, Buster. He extracted the ring from the case and tossed the case onto the couch. And only on your finger. Gently, he took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. However, it took more than a simple push to get it on, and once on, she turned it and winced. Jeff exhaled hard. Aw, crud. I got the wrong size. I knew I was going to do that. I guessed and... No, she said softly. It's perfect. Her hand went up into the side of his hair and she gazed into his eyes. Just like you. Okay, now I know it's wrong, he said with a laugh. He took her hand from the side of his head and pulled it down in front of them. It's not a big deal. I'll just take it in and get it resized. I kind of figured I'd have to. But I don't want to give it back to you, she said, pouting as she pulled her hand to her chest. I just got it. And when you get it back, it'll be right, he said, pulling her hand away gently. He tugged on the ring, but it didn't move. Reluctantly, Lisa sighed. Okay, but only if you promise to take good care of it. She twisted the ring off her finger and held it out to him. I promise. You're never going to believe this in a million years, Lisa said to a half-asleep Haley over the phone the minute after she arrived home. Oh no, what now? I'm getting married. Married? Haley's voice came awake even as it dropped into incredulousness. I thought you said you'd walk a mile on burning hot coals before you'd ever tie yourself to some idiot guy. Haley's words stopped for a moment. Wait, this isn't that fireman you were seeing, is it? Yes, what's wrong with a fireman? Well, for one thing, their pay is lousy. They've got long hours and scary work. Doesn't exactly sound like your kind of guy, whatever that is. Lisa didn't want to think of Jeff as the job he held. He was the man she loved, strong, steady, dependable, and gentle. He was exactly the guy she hadn't been looking for. Being a fireman also means he cares about others. He puts people before a paycheck, and he's got more courage in one little finger than most guys have in their whole testosterone-filled bodies. Whoa, okay, I get it, Haley said slowly. So, when's the big day? I don't know, Lisa said, looking at her left hand and smiling at the memory of the ring. We haven't said it yet. Uh-huh. But as soon as we do, I'm going to need a matron of honor. Matron? Ugh, that sounds so old. Okay, how about the lady who's been married 6 months, but still wants to be called maid of honor? Much better. Gabe was thrilled. In fact, Jeff got toasted with coffee by the whole station. Even Hayes congratulated him, saying that now Lisa would have no time to make that trip over because of all the wedding plans. Jeff's memory crumpled over Hayes's previous invitation. Oh, man, I forgot to give her your message. Hayes smiled. I think you've had a few more important things on your mind. A few, Jeff agreed. Just tell her to stop by any time, Hayes said. I'm sure I'll be around. This paperwork has overtime written all over it. I'll try to remember, sir, Jeff said. Did you get my ring back? Lisa asked the moment she opened his door the next evening. No. He accepted her kiss as he stood at the stove. It's going to take a week. A week? It's one little ring. That's the problem, he said with a smile. This is ready. You hungry? Starving, she said, unbuttoning the front of her jacket and pulling the clip from her hair. I think that energy bar I ate for lunch ran out sometime around 3. Energy bar? That's nutritional. Well, it's better than nothing. She reached past him into the cabinet for the plates, and when her body brushed his, he glanced down the side of her. That could get you in trouble. Setting the plates on the counter, she opened the silverware drawer. Oh yeah? What kind of trouble? Before she grabbed a breath from saying those words, she was pinned against the refrigerator, a spoon in one dangling hand. This kind, he said, pressing next to her. His lips found the top of her blouse, and life shifted. Lower, lower his lips went, tracing zigzag lines across her neck. You really should learn to behave yourself. I was just setting the table, she said breathlessly. Yeah, that's what you say. The pressure of his lips slid down her throat. I swear, officer, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I may have to take you in anyway. We've had a rash of heart stealers running around recently. He backed up and looked right at her with the intensity of a laser. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Lost in the middle of his eyes, she shook her head without moving it. I wouldn't have a clue. When his lips found hers, she was glad for the refrigerator. There was no way her knees would ever have been able to keep her standing. At that moment, the timer on the stove dinged and his kiss slowed and then stopped. Hold that thought, he said, and stepped over to take the casserole out of the oven. Slowly, she slid away from the refrigerator, having never realized how warm one could get. Man, it's hot in here. The humidity outside must be creeping up again today. He looked at her with a hazy light in his eyes. I don't think it's the humidity. A memory dropped between them, and the lightness dissipated. He swung the dish over to the table, and she followed, picking up the plates from the cabinet on her way. Oh, I forgot to tell you, Jeff said as he sat down. Hayes wants to see you. Yeah, right. No, really. He told me yesterday, but you make it hard to remember anything. He smiled at her as she sat down, and in case she didn't understand what he meant, he leaned over and kissed the top of her head. He said he's free any night this week. He'll be in the office around 4 or so if you want to come in. Oh, she said softly. The thought of going to the station exploded through the peaceful dream she had been diligently building in her head. Maybe I'll come tomorrow, if I get time. Jeff dug into the casserole that now sat in the middle of the table. If you do, watch out. They may throw you a parade. A parade? She asked skeptically. I've never been congratulated so many times in my life, and that includes 3 separate graduations. He laughed. That's just a friendly warning. She nodded, getting lost in thought until her senses picked up that he was looking at her with a questioning concern in his eyes. Quickly, she looked at him and smiled. I'll keep that in mind. So, is Lisa coming today? Gabe asked in that deep bass that had become so familiar to Jeff over the last few months. I told her about Hayes, but I don't know. She didn't sound too keen on the idea, Jeff said, re-threading the hose up to Gabe at the top of the engine as their practice run ended. You should call her, Gabe said. Tell her we'll even make her supper if she'll come. Is that a bribe or a threat? Miller's cooking. You be the judge. Bribery. Definite bribery. Although Gabe laughed, Jeff's spirit curled around the plan. Something told him her turning him down cold was a real possibility, and even it being just a small possibility ripped his heart out. Friday afternoon, all day long, Lisa had been fighting the thought of going to the station. Truth be told, she had been fighting it longer than that. Just the thought of the station, of what it meant for him, for her, was enough to send her spirit crashing through the depression. No, if she just stayed away, pretended it didn't exist, somehow came up with a way to convince herself that it wasn't a part of their reality, then life felt almost normal. It was only when she thought about the station, and more to the point, him at the station, that breathing became like running a jagged knife through her heart and soul. "I forgot to tell you," Sherry said, standing in Lisa's door at 4 when Lisa had all but succeeded in solidifying the excuse that there was no way she could go for all the work stacked on her desk. "Jeff called while you were out for lunch." The perceptive smile her secretary slid onto her face was unnecessary. "He said if you'll come around 5, Gabe said you can have supper with them at the station tonight." Lisa buried her gaze in the paperwork on her desk. "Oh, okay. Thanks." Sherry nodded knowingly and shut the door. Lisa closed her eyes. This was horrible. No escape, no excuse, no way out. Her worst nightmare come true. "That hose couldn't have been any more trouble if it had tried," Bob Miller said as Lisa sat in the break room, surrounded by 10 of Houston's finest. Of course, the finest one of all was sitting right beside her, with one arm slung around her chair, and that lopsided grin spread across his face. Her heart danced as she looked at his profile, remembering why she had fallen for him in the first place. Sitting around the tables, they really were very much like a little family, kidding and teasing, but very much caring about the others seated there. "It got snagged on the top and then on the bumper," Zach Jameson said, laughing. "It was a good thing it was only a practice run, because whatever was burning would have been toast by the time we got that hose over there." "Rainier was thrilled," Gabe said before taking a drink of water. "I think I got like 5 demerits for that one run." "Yeah, but who knew they'd tied that thing down?" Jeff said, sliding into the conversation easily. "I mean, who ties a hose down? That's like saying, it's here, but you can't use it." "I'll tell you what, though," Bob said with a laugh. "I would have given a mint to have a video of you up top trying to untie that thing. It's loose. No, it's not. It's loose. No, it's not. I thought, oh boy, what has the Academy sent us this time?" "I'm sure," Jeff said with a laugh. "I'm just glad I'd been here for a while. That would have been a great first impression." He smiled at Lisa, who remembered her first impression of him, and her gaze fell to the table. "So, Lisa, when are you going to hog-tie our boy here and make it official?" Bob asked, clapping Jeff on the shoulder. "Hog-tie?" Lisa asked skeptically, and then she shrugged as embarrassment descended on her. "Whenever he has 4 days off in a row, I guess." "Ah, a very politically correct answer there," Zach said, nodding. "Smart woman. She knows which side of her bread the butter's on." "Just trying to make sure Hayes doesn't permanently ban me," she said seriously. "He loves me so much." "That's okay," Zach said. "I'm sure one of us could manage to sneak you in the back if we had to." "There's a hole in the roof, too." "Well, there was," Bob offered. "We used to crawl out at night and go down to the donut shop." "It looks like it," Gabe taunted, looking at Bob's rounded belly. "I think the first thing on my list is patching that hole." "Too late. Rainier caught us. Hole's gone now," Bob said mournfully. "Pitiful thing to have to live in a place with weights, but no donuts," Zach said, shaking his head. "Just pitiful." The laugh that started in Lisa's throat slammed into the alarm that blared to life around them, and simultaneously, every gaze at the table looked up. "Well, party's over," Gabe said, pushing out of the chair as sheer panic seized Lisa. Unsteadily, she stood as Jeff jumped to his feet, leaned over, and kissed the edge of her cheek. "Got to go." He squeezed her hand once and followed the others out the door. Stunned to the core, she stood there watching him go, and she couldn't even feel fear, just complete numbness. Slowly, she walked to the break room door and laid a hand on it as 3 men rushed down the hallway past the glass. Her hands pushed through the door, although in reality she felt like it was someone else moving, and she was just watching life from their eyes. "Everybody in!" someone yelled from the truck. A bang on the side of the engine, and the huge metal monster rolled forward out of the opening in the wall, blasting a horn and blaring the siren as it did so. The sounds were ear-splitting, but more than that, they were soul-splitting. Her last glimpse as it bumped into the street was of the 3 men in the back pulling on their suits. She now knew how heavy those suits were, and yet how horribly inconsequential they could be in the face of... Trying to push those thoughts out of her mind, she turned back for the break room. The last thing they needed to be doing when they got back was dishes. It wasn't much, but it was something she could do, and at that moment she had to do something to help, or she would go insane with the bottled-up grief, anger, and concern so overwhelming she felt like she had fallen into a deep, dark well with no light and no way to get to the top. Oh God, please. Taylor and Miller, cut the vents. Jameson, set the vent fan. Gabe ticked off the assignments as they swung around one corner. Jeff nodded as his stomach knotted inside of him. That look. He hated the look she had given him. It said all the things that he didn't want to face, and more. When they screeched up to the house, which had billows of smoke rising from one side window, the 6 of them jumped from the truck, and as Jeff laid his ID tag on the front dash, his mind flashed back to the last time he had done that. With a blink, he banished that thought. Concentration was paramount here. Concentration would be what would get him back to reclaim that tag. He grabbed the roof ladder and half of the extension from the truck side and started up the lawn. 40 hours of ladder classes. He should know how to do this in his sleep. Click went the extension until it was positioned on the eave of the roof. 1 step, 2, he climbed. At the top, he angled his way onto the roof and closer to the peak, where carefully he hooked the top of the roof ladder on and then attached himself to it. "You got it?" Bob asked from the extension where he held the chainsaw. "Done." The chainsaw changed hands, and duty took over. He was here to do a job that could mean someone's life. That's why he had started this in the first place, and now it was a part of him. The chainsaw in his hand roared to life, 1 life at a time. Just save 1 life at a time, and someday, surely, he would be able to outrun the ghosts that were gathering at his heels. The dishes were all done. Lisa had even convinced herself that they would come back if she just put them all away. However, the dishes were away, and they still weren't back. She knew she should leave, go home. There was no one here, no reason to stay, and yet something in her just had to know he was all right. She wished she'd had the sanity to decipher the message when it had come in. Maybe then she would at least know where he was and what kind of call it was. As it stood, she had no idea. Pushing through the break room door to the station beyond, she walked out as fear and helplessness fought for control inside her. 1 wire mesh step at a time, she climbed until 8 up, she stopped and slid down against the wall, praying like she had never prayed before. It wasn't fair to ask him to do this, she told God. He had as much right to this life as anyone else, more than some. He was a good guy. He didn't deserve to die out there fighting to save someone else's life. It was then that she thought about Dustin. How had his final call come in? Much like that one had? A simple call out, and he never made it back to the station. She wondered how it had happened. Maybe he was fighting the fire and he fell into something he couldn't get out of. Or had someone made a horrible mistake, miscalculated how long a mission would take, and he was caught without air? Was he alone when it happened? Or was someone there fighting to get him out immediately, but it took too long? The scenarios, each one worse than the one before, played and replayed through her head. Had he known it was the end before it was? Had he felt it? In that last moment, who had he thought about? Eve, to be sure. Jeff, maybe. But who else? Or was it too quick to think about anything or anyone? 1 split second, and it was over. How many 1 split seconds was Jeff facing right now? She tried to breathe for him, tried to force the air from her lungs into his, 1 more breath so that he might get to the next. Exhausted by the non-stop battle she had been fighting since she'd first gotten that call in the middle of the night, she let her head fall back against the hard wall. She didn't want to picture the scene he was living right now, and yet it was all she could focus on. Men racing around, trying to beat back a furious dragon bent on taking them down with it. And it could. It had. Her mind traced to Eve standing by that coffin, and Lisa's heart twisted. Eve had loved Dustin, but what difference had that made? He was gone now. From dust we came, and to dust we shall return. He was dust now, cold and dead. What power had love wielded in the face of that moment when death took him? None. Death took one look at love and laughed. It had swept Dustin into its arms and flown down into the pits of darkness. Love never fails. Who had been dumb enough to write that? From where she sat, it looked like love never triumphed. Even her mother's love, that soul-sapping love she had professed to have, had died. It said so down at the county courthouse on the divorce decree. Eve's love was lying in a graveyard, dead. Over and over, Lisa had watched girlfriends, clients, employees. One minute they were so in love they were practically hysterical. The next minute, they hated the other person. She had to be kidding herself if she thought that love could ever triumph in the end. It was ludicrous. What made her think that their love could last when so many others had perished before them? What made her think that they would be the lucky ones? What made her think that one day that truck wouldn't pull back into this station, one rider short for all eternity? And she would be the one left standing, holding a flag in some cold, gray graveyard, and love would again have lost. What was love, anyway? It was a feeling, and feelings change. How many times had she said that to Haley when Haley had first come home talking about this wonderful guy she had just met? Walk a mile across burning coals? Lisa laughed softly at the thought. It wasn't far from what she was doing right now. The searing pain shooting through her at that moment couldn't have been that different. Then his face drifted into her consciousness. Jeff holding her. Jeff smiling. Jeff sitting there, gaze down, that first night in the booth. Ugh! Her breath released with one whoosh as she banged her head against the wall, and then her forehead dropped to the hand she put to it. Thinking about him made her heart hurt, and that wasn't how it was supposed to be. Love isn't about when it's easy, her mother said in her ears. But does it always have to hurt this bad? She asked the empty fire station beyond. Because I don't think I can stand it if it does. The fire was small, 1 truck, 2 holes, 3 hours. By 11 o'clock, they were backing back into the station. The men around Jeff talked happily, glad to be home, and hoping that would be the last call for the night. The shower's going to feel really good right now, Bob said. You know, you could have warned me about that flower bed. How was I supposed to know you were going to take a mud bath in it? Zach asked as Bob lifted his mud-caked boots from the floor. I'm thinking flowers, dirt, water. What did you think it was going to be? A rock garden? Ha ha. It's stand down time, everybody, Gabe called from the door as he slid out onto the concrete below. First one to the showers, first one to bed. Hallelujah, Zach said, jumping down. Don't anyone get in my way. I've got a date with Dreamland. Jeff slid out of his seat in the middle as Bob, Zach, and the rest of the crew shuffled off to the showers. However, Gabe stayed back to go over the engine in case that wasn't the only call for the night. When the others were gone, Jeff stopped. You need some help? Gabe looked up as he flipped across the ladder brackets and laughed. That's a dumb question. Just thought I'd ask. I can pull that cotton down and get a new one up there. And Bob was worried about what the Academy sent us, Gabe said, shaking his head. If you're offering, I'm not saying no. With a hit on the engine door, Jeff went around the back, his boots clumping loudly on the floor. It wasn't a problem helping Gabe out. Sleeping would be the bigger problem anyway. A hand up, and a hand up, and he was up top, pulling the one hose they had actually used down. "I'm going to go get out of these boots," Gabe called. "They're killing my feet." Jeff nodded his acknowledgement and went back to work, sliding the hose down the back of the truck. Maybe if he worked a little while longer, he would be so tired he would be able to fall asleep. That would be a new phenomenon. He hadn't had a good night's sleep since... That's when, in the middle of the dead quiet station, he first heard the sound. Soft, pitiful, like a muffled sob. His hands stopped as his gaze swept across the room in instant concern. The moment he saw her huddled on the stairs next to the wall in the darkness, he knew who it was. The hose, already halfway down, dropped to the concrete unaided. His turnout gear was still in the truck. There was a hose he had promised to replace lying on the floor, but all his brain could say was that she needed him right now. She needed him, and all else fell away. He jumped off the truck, and in 3 strides he was at the stairs, but his steps slowed on the climb up when she looked down at him. Tear-streaked and careworn, her face held only sorrow and fear. "Lise?" he asked softly when his foot found the step 2 down from her and slid first to a knee and then all the way down on the step in front of her. She was wrapped around herself, pulling her knees in so closely to her chest that he wondered how she could so much as breathe. Tenderly, he reached out to touch her as the sorrow in her eyes knotted around his heart. "Have you been here the whole time?" She looked at him and gulped back the tears as she nodded. "I couldn't leave." "Oh, baby." He tried to get closer to her, but the steps weren't making that easy. "Why didn't you go home?" I had to know you were okay," she said as the tears overtook the words. "Oh, God, I'm sorry." When he reached up to brush the hair from her temple, the clasp around her knees broke, and she squeezed her eyes closed, fighting the flood right behind her eyes. She turned to him, and for a moment her head dropped onto his shoulder. He kissed the side of her hair as he held her gently. "I'm so sorry." Pain was all he saw in her eyes when she finally pulled back from him. "I'm sorry," she said brokenly. "I can't do this. I've got to go." In the next breath, she stood, and her feet carried her past him down the stairs. "No, Lisa, wait." He tried to grab her hand, but she yanked it away from his grasp as he stood. "Can we talk about this?" She never slowed down. In fact, she narrowly missed knocking right into Gabe when he reappeared from the hallway. "Lisa," Gabe said in surprise, following her with his gaze as she opened the station door with a snap, walked out, and slammed it behind her. Then Gabe's gaze traveled up to Jeff, who stood in stunned speechlessness on the stairs above. Oh no. This has been To Protect and Serve, Volume 1 of the Courage series. Written by Staci Stallings, narrated by Becky Dowdy. Copyright 2012 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings. This has been a Braveheart Audiobooks production.
What's coming next? Find out. Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel and never miss a second of the story.